For many years now, software companies sold the idea that if you buy the best software, you'll get the best results. The companies that built the best products would come out on top, weaker competitors would fade away, and competition would keep driving the industry forward. But doesn't it seem like somewhere along the way that stopped being how the software business works? I mean, today, some of the most expensive software in the world is also some of the most heavily criticized. Enterprise software is infamous for being frustrating to use, and somehow these programs keep getting slower, even though they're running on hardware that's hundreds of times more powerful than what they were originally built for and used on. Yet despite all of that, these companies continue generating billions of dollars in revenue. Which poses a very basic question. If the software is so frustrating, why not just stop using it? And if there's nothing better, why doesn't someone just build something better? But as with any basic question, the answer is that this had already happened many times. Over the past decade, thousands of companies have released software that's faster, cheaper, easier to use, and in many cases, completely free. And for years, it barely made a difference as businesses kept buying the same product anyway. However, over the last few years, something has clearly started to change. Adobe, a company I'm sure you all know and love, attempted to acquire Figma to effectively kill off competition, but wasn't able to do so due to regulators in the US and Europe strongly opposing this merger in favor of allowing competition. VMware customers began looking elsewhere after Broadcom overhauled its licensing model. Blender evolved from a niche open source project into a tool that many professionals now rely on, and DaVinci Resolve has steadily gained ground in an industry that once seemed very locked down. And so for the first time in decades, a lot of big companies no longer look quite as untouchable as they once did. But to understand why they were untouchable in the first place though, you have to go back to a time when software companies really did compete on the quality of their products. During the 1980s and 1990s, software was an intensely competitive business. There was a lot of new computer stuff people just weren't used to doing, like building spreadsheets, editing photos, designing buildings, or managing payroll. But this was now the gold rush of office work, and some people decided to start selling shovels by creating companies trying to solve these problems. And due to this being a very new and unstable industry, you had to make something people genuinely preferred if you wanted your company to succeed. If a competitor released a faster product, offered better features, or was cheaper, customers would just switch without any thought. At that point, success really did just depend on building better software. So over time, the strongest companies naturally pulled ahead. Adobe became the standard of creative work for a reason. Autodesk established itself across engineering and architecture, Oracle found its way into some of the world's largest businesses, and Microsoft Office became so common that it was pretty much impossible to imagine office work without it. All of these companies had, at the time, created products which were more coherent and useful than competitors, and so they got a lot of users who finally felt like they could trust the software they were using. But eventually, these companies discovered something even more valuable than just making the best software. Imagine you're running a company with 40,000 employees. Every document your business has ever created lives in Microsoft Office. Every financial record sits inside Oracle. Every designer works in Photoshop, and every engineer has spent years mastering Autodesk. Your entire business or job now depends on all of these systems. And now let's say some new startup launches tomorrow with software that's twice as good. Are you going to switch over? As a worker, this means spending your time learning something that nobody in the industry has begun using yet, so the smart move would be to avoid doing anything with it. And as a business, switching means having to now fire or retrain thousands of employees, migrating decades of files, and completely changing your systems and workflows and documentation, and you get the idea. And after all that's done, will there even be any guaranteed benefits to doing so? And so once the software industry realized just how hard it is for businesses to do all of these things, their strategy changed so that instead of competing to build the best product, many started competing to become as deeply woven into their customers' businesses as possible. Take something like Oracle. Ask almost any database administrator what they think about Oracle's licensing model, and chances are you'll get a very long answer. The company has spent years facing criticism over complex licensing rules, expensive support contracts, and aggressive software audits. Yet Oracle remains one of the largest software companies in the world because replacing Oracle often costs even more than keeping it, so you just deal with its issues. The same exact pattern shows up across tons of other software like Salesforce and Workday, just to name a few, which are products employees often complain about, but after an organization has spent years building its operations around them, replacing them becomes an enormous undertaking, which means that as the software company, you can be a lot more bold with your rules and costs, knowing that nobody will be switching anyway. The biggest example of this that people bring up is Adobe, which initially did a lot of work to make good products and maintain them quickly. But once companies had all standardized on Adobe's ecosystem, now the company no longer had to compete with the same urgency, which is annoying as a user but makes total sense if you think from Adobe's shoes. And so over the years we get Creative Cloud instead of buying the software once, which also brought cancellation fees for some reason. Alongside that, the software became more bulky and performance heavy, prices seemed to increase often. Just in general, users began feeling like they're no longer paying for new things and constant innovation, but only paying because leaving had become a lot more difficult than just staying. However, you may have a counter argument to this. Is this just not what happens when you build software to last for decades? I mean, a small startup can throw away its entire product if customers want something different. Not that that wouldn't be annoying, but it's fairly easy. Large software companies, however, don't have that luxury. By the time a product has millions of users, thousands of enterprise customers, and years of integrations behind it, changing anything carries some level of risk. You've likely used big software yourself and wonder why they won't fix some sort of obvious problem. But of course, when dealing with the fact that there are tens to hundreds of millions of people that use your product every day, you kinda have to be absurdly careful with literally anything you do. I mean, even changing the interface slightly can create problems for millions of people who now have to relearn it. When you first start out, you do a lot of these changes to see what resonates with people, but that's exactly what successful software did, and that's why they are now so complex. Photoshop has spent more than 3 decades adding tools for different industries and different kinds of users. Microsoft Office still supports file formats and compatibility features that date back to decades. Enterprise platforms often feel overwhelming because each new version is built on top of the one before it instead of replacing it. Do you see the issue here? While these large companies were maintaining products that had grown over decades, newer competitors had the opportunity to start with a blank page. They didn't need to recreate everything Adobe, Microsoft, or Autodesk had already built. Most of them just focused on one specific problem and tried to solve it better than anyone else. I brought up Figma earlier, and that's exactly what it did with interface design. Instead of competing with Photoshop across every category of creative work, it just built software around the way modern product teams actually collaborate. DaVinci Resolve took a similar approach. It wasn't trying to replace every application in Adobe Creative Cloud on day one. It only had to convince editors that for video work, there was finally another serious option they could try that is actually modern, fresh, and more frequently changing. And obviously Blender, which started as just a free and simple 3D tool, became literally the most popular one just by continuing to be good at what it's supposed to do. And you can find similar stories across almost every category of software. New competitors rarely try to match the market leaders feature for feature anymore. More often, they build something simpler, faster, or easier to use. Sometimes that means offering fewer features or rethinking the entire workflow instead of adding another menu or another checkbox. But why is this happening now? Why couldn't people back then just use multiple tools for different purposes as they do today? And why did every popular tool come so loaded with features? Well, it's quite a boring answer, but building serious software used to require enormous resources. The companies at the top could afford hundreds of engineers, massive QA teams, dedicated support staff, and years of development before a product ever generated any meaningful revenue. Even if some startup had a better idea, you just didn't have any accessible tools to execute on it, while all the big companies did. So with software being more of a rare thing, of course you'd only want to pick one and use it for everything. This started to change when the internet got more tools and resources that people could use for free to build programs. However, you still had to learn the code and use specific programs, and while a fair amount of very good software came out of this, it wasn't enough to shake the large companies. But now we have AI, which many are still misusing and overhyping and underhyping, so it hasn't really settled into its proper potential just yet. But many people today use AI for at least something, and a good amount of people are using it to create software. Despite the headlines, it hasn't replaced software engineers, and it probably won't anytime soon. What it has done is remove a very big amount of repetitive work. Developers spend less time writing annoying code, searching documentation, or tracking down straightforward bugs. Features that once took months to prototype can now be quickly made, tested, and discarded in maybe an hour or less. You may think the biggest companies benefit from these tools just as much as anyone else, but the difference is that smaller teams now benefit proportionately more. A startup with 20 engineers can accomplish far more today than a team of the same size could only a few years ago, and it has access to many of the same AI models as companies worth hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, hell, even just as one person, you can do so many things now that a team of 50 people maybe could also achieve 10 years ago, as long as you know what you're doing. Overall, having a big and complex piece of software that's being worked on by hundreds of people seems to just be useless today when so many options are available for you to choose from. It made sense to have a full package of features before, but you can now use one app for editing and another app for photography and another one for whatever else. You get the idea. All that big companies have going for them today is that resistance to switch over, but we are already seeing many people becoming much more familiar with multitasking modern software and AI rather than just using one thing. And I also believe much more companies today are starting fresh and already expect people to be proficient in multiple tools rather than just lock them down to one. And so while the giants of software still make money, I think it's very clear that something will happen soon that will force them to either finally modernize or slowly die off and lose all of their users. Whatever the case is, I'm curious to hear what you think about all of this in the comments, and thank you for watching.